So I called my dad, who I was working for at the time, making fake teeth. I called him and said, Dad, you know that band I'm always talking about, Con and Moxon? I went to the show and he said, do you want to go on tour with me? And Dad was like, go for it, son. You got to do it. I'm Rory McCarthy. I make music that is most of the time called Infinite Bisous. I also make music under other names and I play with other musicians. I've been playing in a band called Con and Moxon for nearly 10 years. So that's who I am for now. I started making music that I was kind of jokingly calling Infinite Bisous when I was making another album, which was called Column. For no reason at all, we just decided, me, my brother and my friend Joe, we decided we were going to move for a month or two to the middle of the French countryside and make an album there. My brother and I had a really strong idea of what the album would be. So we went out there and we just worked there, and while we were there, a lot of things were happening in my life. It was a very dramatic period, so I started making lots of other music at the same time, and I made the foundation for what would become With Love, which is the first Infinite Bisous album, on the same trip. So while I was in France, I made Column and Infinite Bisous. And then I went back home to my home studio, Descartes, and I finished off both of those records, and it took a while longer. And then more dramatic things happened, and so Infinite Bisous started to become the main way I would make music and the main output. It's called Any Day Now. I've done most of it now, but the way that I like to make albums is I like to have quite a strong idea of what it is, and I have that usually from the start. Like I often have the artwork and an idea of the track listing before it's made, so that I know what I'm aiming towards, and I hear music that I want to make and then I aim towards that as close as I can. And so I started hearing the music for this record probably while I was releasing Period, because I made Period quite a long time before I released it. I was starting to make what I was hearing then, and the challenge is to kind of, even though it takes a long time, not to try and update what you think it should be now. You try and stick to the original idea of what the album should be. So I don't touch it too much. Like the original track list for it is still the case, and I go back to it and I listen to it, and if I get excited about the whole album again, I'll do a lot of work because new ideas will come up that fit the thing. And if I don't have any ideas, I just leave it. And so it can take a really long time to make a record, because I try not to go in and just, I don't like to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to work on my album now and just start working, because I have no direction to go in. So if you only wait to hear the music in your head, it can take a long time. For the Infinite Bisous records, I've done everything myself. I did everything, and I do it wherever home is at the time. Like I don't go to studios. And in terms of the creative process, I don't do demos. Often the very first time you sit down, and this is going back to this what you hear in your head thing, if you can really hear it right now, you can reproduce it much better. So months later, when you're trying to reinterpret what you heard, it's usually further away, so it's harder. So the best thing for me to do is get as much out as possible in the first sitting, and then my job is more arranging it, adding new sections, but not really touching the original one. We kind of made that decision long before Infinite Bisous and lots of other stuff. I had an experience of record labels, independent or major, and I've never found them to be very exciting. And the way that they're released, I often find the approach is often to go to find people who might be interested in the music before them knowing it. And what I always thought was maybe it would be better if people who find it and like it can do it by themselves and not try to force it on people too much. And so we started this thing called Tasty Morsels, morsels.website. And with that, we really just announced that we've released something on, social media, and that's about it. We don't really do anything else because, I don't know, I can't really be bothered to. I don't really want to put any effort into pushing it on people, but also that's kind of enough, I think, just telling people it's released. And so we've done that with my albums, with other stuff that we've released, and I've enjoyed watching people find it. And also it takes a long time, you know, it's not in the traditional model with record labels, it tends to be they call a record campaign, you know, so they push and they pay for advertising and all sorts of stuff, so it kind of goes up, but then it goes down as quickly sometimes. So if you let it grow really slowly, it seems to go down just as slowly. You know, there's still people finding out about my first album, and I released it in, I don't know when, but a few years ago. And so I think people feel less in a rush to find it. And you know, there's not that feeling of like, oh, that's over now because it was released last year or something, you know. So I think it's kind of nice. It's quite respectful to the music just to leave it, and if people like it, they like it, that's cool. If they don't, that's fine too, you know. This new life has started. I think from the first album going to the second and now going to the third, I don't know if there's been an evolution, but I'm constantly trying to get closer to the same thing in a way, which is each time I heard a type of music in my head, and I'm trying to get as close to that as possible without letting my hands and my kind of skill or lack of skill get in the way. When I hear my first album, I like it for what it is, but I also hear that my hands got in the way because I didn't know how to express something I was hearing in my head. And so for the second album period, I was concerned with getting closer to the idea, and with this one I'm trying to get closer and closer to the music I'm hearing in my head, which is evolving itself, so there is an evolution. But to be honest, even if I made 10 albums that sounded the same, as long as that's the music I'm hearing in my head, that's fine by me. I suppose my first example of someone who was making music as a living was someone who lived in the town that I went to school in, Loughborough. His name's Sam Eastgate, and he had a band called Late of the Pier. And now he has a band called La Priest, or LA Priest. And he was making an album in Loughborough with Conan Moccasin at the time. So, and there is no music scene in Loughborough. There's no venue, you can't play anywhere really. There's like a couple of pubs maybe, but so it's really bizarre that there was that going on. And he was one of my best friends at school's brother, Sam. So I started hanging out with him when all of my friends went to university. He's a bit older than me, and so I started hanging out with him and making a lot of music with him, and it was really inspiring for me because he has a very, very natural way of making music, and he's a pretty amazing musician. So I got to make a lot of music with him, and then Conan started coming to visit, and so I started making music with him and Conan, and they eventually made this album called Soft Hair. And I'd only met Conan a couple of times, and I loved his music. I was really, really a big fan of his music. I had a poster in my studio of Conan Moccasin, and it was my album of the year for like 3 years. You know, I just kept saying to everyone, "It's the best. You got to hear this." And so eventually he asked me when me and Sam went to see a show of his in Manchester, and he said, "Would you like to come on stage and play with us tonight?" And so I said, like, sure, but what am I going to play? You know, he'd never seen me play an instrument at this point. He said, "I don't know, we have some bongos." So I went on stage and played bongos. I met the band on stage. I was like, "Hi guys," who I've now been in a band with for 10 years. And so I started off on bongos, and after the show he said, "That was great, do you want to come on tour with us?" So I called my dad, who I was working for at the time, making Fake Teeth. I called him and said, "Dad, you know that band I'm always talking about, Conan Moccasin? I went to the show and he said, do you want to come on tour with me?" And Dad was like, "Go for it, son, you got to do it." So he found someone to fill in for me making Fake Teeth, and went on tour. And then we just kept doing that, we just kept touring. And a lot of that was in France as well. We kept coming to France quite often, so that was how I got involved in Paris and that kind of stuff too. So yeah, it was a pretty big turning point. I was 19 at the time. The feeling of going on tour and playing music is very different because, for example, to make a record, all I've got to do is have an idea and then try and get close to it. The musicianship is almost not very important to me. Like it doesn't really matter how I get there as long as it sounds right. So if I end up playing one note and then sampling it and, you know, doing some kind of computer trickery, or whether I do one take of a thing that sounds great as it is. So I don't have to actually play a whole song or anything like that. When you're on stage, of course, you're playing the entire set at once, so you have to actually memorize. When I tour with Infinite Bisous, I have to learn my songs again, because I never really learned them. I did them one piece by one, maybe months apart. So with bands like Con and Moccasin, that's a really interesting example, because a lot of it is improvised within. We all sort of know what the song is, but we don't practice or we've never rehearsed with Con and Moccasin. So it's like we just do something that sounds something like the song, and then it kind of drifts off to something else. It depends on the band too. I mean, I did one tour with Mac DeMarco. That was pretty straightforward. It was like, you know, I played the bass parts were already written. Mac came to my house before the tour, a couple of days before the tour, and he showed me like, okay, here's how this song goes, here's how this song goes. And then we went on tour and I played them like that, you know. I find home really inspiring, wherever home is at the time, you know. Even as a kid, I always, whenever my parents would book a holiday, I'd be like, but why? We're good here, right? Like, what's wrong? Why can't we? I've got so much stuff that I could be getting on with, you know. Even as a kid, I had like projects, you know, that I needed to, it would be a distraction to go away from me, and it still kind of feels like that. Like when I'm away, there's not enough room to move and to think and not to think and whatever, but I don't get so many ideas when I'm away, because I know there's not so much possibility to make those ideas come to fruition. So when I'm at home, I know if I have an idea, I can put it down straight away. And so there's a kind of freedom to that. It means I don't have to work all the time or keep going with music. I can just live my life, and when I have ideas, I can work on it. It's quite funny sometimes, because you're a musician, you get asked to DJ or to make a playlist or something, and I always find it really, really hard. I'm like, oh man, what songs do I know? Like, or if someone says at a party, you know, like, oh, put some music on, you like music? It's like I've never heard music in my entire life. I'm like, I can't think of a single song, you know. It's really strange. So I'm not very plugged in with what's coming out right now, unless one of my friends is involved in it or something like that. But if I, you know, my record collection at home is classified into decades, and there's like 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's kind of pretty big, and then it gets to 90s, 2000s, and it's like half a rack, you know. I have like really not much stuff, so I'm pretty far behind. I've got a lot of catching up to do. But I also think there's so much great music that I'm not done exploring like all of those decades. So I've not even got to the 90s yet, really. Like there's a couple of great records that I love from that and the noughties, but it takes a long time to work through that stuff. And there's a lot of it, so I'm pretty far behind.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll find this stuff in 10 years, you know. That's the other thing I was saying about how to release music too, is you don't have to hear it when it's coming out, you know. You don't have to, if you miss it when it's kind of hype, it doesn't matter. You can hear it in 10 years, and if it's good, it will still sound good. So I'm not worried about missing the moment or anything. There is one person I really like at the moment that I've just thought of. He's a drummer, he's called J.D. Beck. And Mac DeMarco introduced me because he has a band with this girl called Domi, who's a keyboard player. And it's crazy. It's really, really crazy. And that I really love. I love J.D. Beck's drumming mostly. He's really young, he's like 17 or something, but he's incredible. I did that with two friends, and we decided that it'd be interesting to see what would happen if we made music together. So we kind of defined some rules of what it was going to be, like actually completely the opposite to what I've been saying this entire time, which is I like to start with an idea in my head and then go towards that. This time we just said, here's the instruments we're allowed to use. Let's go somewhere and see what happens. And so it was really interesting for me, because of course when you're collaborating with someone, you can't have a really strict idea in your head, because they have their own personality and their own musicianship and their own input. So it would be really annoying if you were like, no, that's not what I have in my head. You know, if I'm on my own, I can do that. But with others, it was interesting just to leave it open and see what happens. And it's a really interesting album. I really enjoyed making it. We went to Arbois, you know, in the Jura, in another wine region, and we rented a yurt, a kind of posh yurt, and yeah, it was really interesting. So we had a really strict regime of what we were allowed to eat, and it was all very humble. We weren't allowed anything, no olive oil, no salt, no. So we ate kind of like medieval slop every night, and it really kind of set a tone for the album, and it's really interesting. I really like it. I listen to it. That's the cool thing with collaborating, is because I don't feel too involved in it, and especially if it's played live, you don't have too much time to overthink stuff, so you can actually listen to it and really enjoy it. Like I don't really ever listen to my own music once it's finished. I listen to only that for a long time, and then once it's finished, I actually don't really listen. Even though I made it for myself to listen to, I forget to in the end. But I've done this new Ob record, I've listened to a lot, I really like it. Another album actually with Conan Moccasin, the band, and his dad. And we made it in Texas, in Marfa, Texas, in a kind of barn. And we made it in about 5 days, and everything was improvised. So we just pressed record and started playing, and no one had any ideas. No one said like, why don't we do something like that? There was no planning whatsoever. We just started playing, and it's all live. And so there's these strange moments where all of a sudden everyone shifts from one thing into another thing without any plan to do so. And so it's this really strange feeling. Like once you listen to it a bit, and I can listen to it because it was a collaboration, you're kind of like, wait, who thought of that idea? Like, how did that happen? But nobody thought of it. It's just you were just going and it happened, you know. It's really cool. So when I do collaborate, I do enjoy it.
Do you want a beer or something?
Sure, yeah, I'll have a beer.